So anyway, so this whole idea of access just plagued me as a special ed director. The frustration I would feel around kids who were in mainstream settings who were not doing well. Not doing nearly as well as we wanted them to be doing, and not nearly as well as we really believed they could be doing. That these were kids who had many, many skills and abilities, and yet we just, it just wasn't coming together for many of the kids. And that's what really drew me to this whole idea of universal design of learning, and that issues around access transcend kids with disabilities. We have many, many, many kids who are in our public schools who, for a variety of reasons, are not accessing the curriculum, and disability is just one of them. And I think the idea of universal design actually allows us to broaden this discussion about kids with disabilities, and allows us to have the discussion about access around all kids. And I think the principles of universal design support that it's about all kids. And kids with disabilities, while yes, they have very unique characteristics, that the whole principle around universal design is that all people are far more different than we are the same. So that maybe people with disabilities are just scattered on this incredibly broad continuum of who people are. And that we can stop always thinking about, well, we have to do this because he has a disability, and maybe we have to do this because lots of people have characteristics that make us need to do this. So I just find that very compelling. And one that I think speaks to truly the idea of inclusion. So what we're going to talk about today, but because I do come from a special ed background, I think it's sort of almost a no-brainer to think about universal design and IEPs. So let me ask you this. Who is here? Who of you are special ed teachers now, practicing? Okay. Do we have any general ed teachers here? Excellent. Do we have students, college students? These guys were here at like 9:20. You are so eager. You see the difference between college students and teachers. You're all coming in, They were here at 9:20. Okay, so great. I'm thrilled that we have a mixed audience, because part of what I have been saddened by over the years is that oftentimes when we talk about things like access and IEPs, oftentimes I'm only talking to special educators. And in a world that really, communities that want to commit themselves to inclusion, we have to be talking to each other. These are not conversations we have with job-alike groups. They are conversations that have to happen across and amongst us all. So I welcome everybody here, and let's get going. The first thing I want to show you is, I think this is, again, I just find little videos that make me laugh, so I'm going to show it to you.
I tried other dating services looking for someone I could spend the rest of my life with.
Yeah, but every time it just never worked out. The computer kept matching me up with all these women looking for their Prince Charming.
Finally, I gave up. I didn't want to be alone anymore, so I called Lowered Expectations.
At Lowered Expectations, we don't use any fancy psychological testing or sophisticated matching techniques. We simply take your name and randomly select another name. We know that some people are tired of waiting on Mr. Right and will settle for Mr. Right Now.
Now I don't have to spend Friday nights playing World of Warcraft. Do that Saturday.
Sure, we don't have anything in common at all, but at least he's male.
And she's a woman. And with Lowered Expectations, that's good for me. Thank you, Lowered Expectations.
Thanks. A lot. We talked about the touching.
All right, So you get the gist. So we don't want to deal with lowered expectations for kids because you see what can happen. All right, so we are going to be talking today about the challenges. And there are many, many challenges we have in schools today, but the one we're going to focus on is that we've got kids with incredibly diverse needs. We've got systems and communities that have, and laws that have increasingly higher and higher and higher expectations of what you're going to do. And the problem is, as we are trying to figure out how to deal with those two challenges, oftentimes we're just doing the same thing, just harder or louder. And that's really what drove me to universal design, to say we've really got to question some very basic constructs about how we design classrooms, how we design schools, how we design lessons, how we design curriculum, because that's really what I think is at the heart of all of this. And for those of us in special education, and for those of you who are in general ed but have kids with disabilities, I think our focus today is really how do we juggle what seem to be fundamentally two conflicting ideas. The I in IEP, individualized education program, individually designed instruction, and for classroom teachers who have this unbelievable pressure to take a group of 20, 30, 40 some odd kids and move them all from wherever they come in at the beginning of the year in September to come out at the other end in reasonably close proximity to skills and knowledge. And I think universal design becomes a tool that allows us to try to make some sense out of all of this. So our goal today is we're going to talk about some of the basic principles of universal design, make sure everybody gets, when we talk about UDL, what we're actually talking about. How can we explicitly connect those principles to the traditional aspects of what's in everybody's IEP, regardless of what state you're in? I mean, there are just certain basic requirements that IEPs need to meet. Make that connection. And what I hope is at the end, we will have connected the dots well enough so that we conclude this, and come to this idea that what's critical for some kids to learn, what it will take for some kids to learn, is actually good for everybody. And that's really the concept of universal design. How do we design for the edges? Okay? Universal design has this concept of there is no such thing as average. If we have time later, I'm going to show you a video. I'm just not sure we'll have, but it's called the myth of average, that there is no such thing as an average learner. So when we design instruction for the average learner, we may in fact be designing it for absolutely nobody. And the idea of universal design is because everybody has a jagged profile. I might have great memory skills, but adequate language skills and poor comprehension skills and okay perceptual skills, because my profile is like this. And that's how everybody's profile, not that it's all the same, but everybody's got a jagged profile. To say we're going to plan for the middle probably means you are actually addressing very, very few kids. Strengths, needs, preferences, and so on and so forth. Okay? So we're going to start to connect the dots through the following activity. I am going to ask you to watch, just look at this picture and I'm just going to flash it for a couple of seconds, and then I want you to just talk to a neighbor. What did you see? Okay? So you can write it down, you can just talk to each other, whatever, okay? So I'm just going to flash this. Tell me, what do you see? What'd you say? Somebody just... A child. Was somebody sick?
Pictures on the wall.
Pictures on the wall. Back in the days. Huh?
Lots of adults.
Lots of adults. Sense of urgency. Chairs. Okay, you all saw different things, right? And because I didn't give you any explicit thing to look for, your eye gravitated and recognized something, right? Okay, certainly you didn't recognize everything there, but you recognized something. So that's the first part of universal design. The first network of universal design is to learn, we've got to be able to recognize things, all right? And we're going to talk about the recognition network, okay? So just keep that in mind. In order to learn, begin the learning process, you have to fundamentally recognize stimulus, all right? So the next thing I want you to do is identify the ages of the people.
40's 10.
40s,
The adults, and then the child was 10.
40 and 10. I thought it was 41 and 11 myself. Okay. So what did you say?
I thought the baby was like younger in a high chair.
Okay, but you focused on the baby in the high chair. All right. So here's what I want you to look at. I'm showing you two different pictures of an eyeball that answered the two questions I've just asked you. Okay? This one up here, when I showed the picture the first time and I just said, what do you see? These are the movements of the eyeball, of the person who was hooked up. And look how they're scanning, right? They're trying to take the whole picture in. This is the picture of tell me the ages of the people. Do you see how much more strategic that is? Same eye, same picture. Why do you think that is? Huh? I gave you a focus. I actually set a goal, a purpose to the activity, and your eye then, you picked a strategy, right, to respond to that different goal. The second brain network is the strategic network. You have to be able to, in your brain, and actually it's right up here, good old frontal lobe, in order for us to engage in learning and expressing what we know, we have a whole part of our brain that's dedicated to planning, action, planning, and expression. And are based on the task I asked you to do, each of you had a strategy to do that. And we can see that very clearly, and this is way more focused, is it not? There's a lot less than the scanning. What do you see? Yes? Okay. One more time. What grabs your attention? What, for you personally, what grabs your attention here? What'd you say? This woman here said, you know, what struck her was the man coming in. There was something intimidating about the gentleman coming into the room. What else? Huh?
The lady standing at the door.
What about her?
Well, she was the only one like in an apron and everything, so like.
Okay, so you focused in on the woman at the door who looked like she
Could have been
a maid or worked there. What else? Huh? Kid on the bed. Did we have a sick kid? What? Okay. So the idea here is, now look at this third. This is the eye slide around what grabbed you. And what grabs you is that engagement piece. What's the salient part of this that was important? Okay. And that's the third network, the affective part of learning. When we are engaged in learning, things that have meaning to us is where our brains are going. That's what's lighting up in that affective network. So here, you could see even far less eye movement, much more concentrated, because this eye was looking at the things in the picture that were most salient to them. So that's our third network. So we've got recognition, we've got strategic, and we've got affective, okay? And that's the core of universal design. So let's sort of, okay, and I know our little students over here, I'm sure you've been learning about zone of proximal development, but what do we know? I mean, there's some real basis here. I mean, this didn't just get discovered. We had some people many, many years ago, you know, saying, 3 prerequisites to learning. 1 must recognize patterns in perceptual information. You got to be able to perceive that stimulus. You have to recognize it. So perceive, sensory, you've got to recognize it, be able to put a meaning to it, and then know what to do with it. We then have to have strategies. Okay, so this is recognition, presentation. We then have to have strategies for acting on it, strategic, expression, and we have to be engaged in the task. It has to have some meaning to the learner, all right? And Vygotsky was talking about this stuff decades and decades and decades ago. And this is exactly what the people around UDL did around connecting this theory to what we now actually know through neuroscience is exactly how the brain is doing this. Because we can watch pictures of the brain when people are learning, doing these 3 things. And the parts of their brain that light up the strongest versus the part that is not as strong, and the difference in how you perceived versus you perceived. So 1, we know there are certain networks critical to learning, brain networks, and we also know all of our brain networks work very differently. That's the jagged profile. Everybody's got those brain networks. Some of them are stronger, some of them are kicking in on all cylinders for all things, some are not. And that's sort of, when you look at all of these pictures, what makes you, the poster up here, I love this. This is, I don't know if they put this purposely here. What makes you different is what makes you special. In other words, you're all special to me. But, you know, I mean, you're all different. That's the interesting part of this, is that there isn't an average. There isn't a normal way to do that. And the zone of proximal development, which we all learned in, you know, Ed 101, and that is, for learning to occur, there has to be an appropriate level of challenge coupled with an appropriate level of support. In other words, challenging but attainable, just outside of the kid's reach, and then we give them the scaffolds to reach it. And then we start to play with those scaffolds to say, some of those scaffolds we will go from extrinsic to intrinsic. We'll teach kids how to scaffold for themselves. For some kids, the scaffolds will come away. And we know for some of our students with very, very significant needs, some of their scaffolds are never going to go away. We're going to teach them how to manage those scaffolds. And think about how many scaffolds we have in our day-to-day life. Any of you have a smartphone? Any of you have your life on your smartphone? You know, you take a shopping list to the grocery store. We are scaffolding and managing our lives all the time. In learning, classroom learning situations, This means providing learning tasks that are too difficult to do independently, but are within the reach with support. And therein lies, I think, our challenge as educators, is that pressure to keep moving forward in curriculum is that we oftentimes, what I oftentimes hear from classroom teachers is, I know this child hasn't gotten it. I have this incredible pressure that I have to move on. And when we move on and think that means we can only move on by removing a support from a kid, that's that process where this kid starts to fall off the truck, and that gap, you know, for some of our kids almost at some point seems to be irreparable, you know, when that happens over and over and over again. So I think we have to always go back, you know, no matter how experienced we are as teachers, to keep going back to some of these real basic lessons. And you look at, to me, this picture. This is a picture I think most people can recognize. And what's happening here? Right, we've got a little kid who just had his training wheels taken off, could not necessarily probably do that independently yet. You got dad scaffolding, right? That's exactly what dad's doing. He's creating. He is the surrogate wheels that are balancing the bike. And can you see their face? I know it's visually it's hard, but the fact is they are actually happy that they're both engaged in this task. The challenge, the scaffolding, the engagement. So, universal design for learning. Universal design for learning comes from universal design for architecture. And a guy named Ron Mace, an architect, came up with this school of thought around designing products and buildings. And it's so simple that you just sort of go, why didn't I think of that? You know, consider the needs of the broadest range of possible users from the beginning. In other words, if I'm creating a school building, let's start off designing it based on all the possible uses it needs to meet, and all, most importantly, the users. Who are the users of this building? Right? Just a brilliant idea. You know, we put in an accessible front door rather than granite steps and then have to build a ramp. Okay, so the idea is the planning from the get-go is predicated on what is the function of this building and who are the users, the potential users. So if I'm designing a county office building and voting booths may be there every November, I know people who come to vote are young people, they're old people in wheelchairs, they're people with disabilities, there's people with walkers, there's mom with strollers. So I have to design this town hall to accommodate all of that, right? Very, very simple, yet, I mean, it's an elegant idea in its simplicity, okay? So, and it's predicated on this idea that once we identify what's critical for some, it'll actually be good for everybody, right? And this picture, this cartoon, I think really sort of sums it up, and we could probably go home after just looking at this cartoon because I think it's so powerful. You got the little kid in the wheelchair in the bottom corner saying, could you shovel the ramp off? And the janitor over here is saying, I've got all these other kids waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling the stairs off, I'll clear the ramp for you. And the kid's response is, but if you clear the ramp, everybody can get in. Clearing a path for people with special needs clears the path for everybody. What's critical for some is good for all. The only way this kid can get into the building is by that ramp. so can everybody else get into that building by the ramp. Everybody but him can get up through the steps, and he can't get up through the steps. So if we take that idea, now think about that ramp, take the snow away, who else is benefiting from that ramp being there? It was put there for that kid in the chair. That was its express purpose for being added on. Who else will get some benefit from that? Huh? All the kids. Who else? Moms coming in for meetings with baby strollers. Who else? Huh? Teachers with bad knees. It's an occupational hazard. Who else? It is, yeah. Grandparents coming in for recitals. Who else? The UPS guy, the guy who brings your reams of paper. Could he clunk up the stairs? If he had to, he would. But I guarantee you, because that ramp was there, he used the ramp, and the quality of his delivery life was enhanced. Critical for Billy in the wheelchair, and actually good for 4, 5, 6 other types of people. That's the key idea here, is that when we design for the edges, who's on the edge? Billy in his wheelchair is on the edge. His physical mobility is not average. It's here in a chair. If I design for most kids can go up the stairs, Billy's not going anywhere. Once I design for Billy, everybody gets in, and everybody's quality of life. So that's the concept of universal design of architecture. It's saying we've got to conceptually shift how we think about building things, how we think about designing things, that the concept of it's okay to do something and then I can retrofit it is fundamentally ineffective and inefficient. Let me put it this way. Let's take out ineffective, because you might still be able to get the kids, Billy, into the door. But it is inefficient because two things had to happen. I had to design the lesson, then I needed time to redesign the lesson. I had to build the stairs, and then I had to build something else. That's inefficient use of time. Most of you have a lot of extra time? No, right. What's the biggest bane of our existence in school? Lack of time. So efficiency, cost. Time is money. If I design something right the first time, or when I say right, inclusively, okay, not right, wrong, when I design for my users up front, it will cost me less. Truly, think about a building. You build a house, you put a bathroom in, whatever it costs you. You then have, grandma come to live with you and you have to retrofit that bathroom. I guarantee you the retrofitting of the bathroom is more expensive than the original cost of the bathroom. So there's nothing we could argue in favor for why retrofitting is a good way for us to spend our time and energy. So the conceptual shift is, let's not retrofit things. Let's conceptually shift and think at the design level. We can add attributes, characteristics, qualities that bring more kids to the table. And it really crunches down to the idea of when we have a one-size-fits-all approach to anything, there's lots of people who don't fit into it. Don't you ladies love the clothes that it's a one-size-fits-all? I can't get my thigh into it. And they're saying, I'm sorry, I'm just not that big, and you're telling me a one-size-fits-all? It doesn't, okay? And that's really the same when we're talking about school. So what is the connection to instruction? And the connection is this. The research around universal design for learning, and this is the stuff that comes out of the people who really developed this concept. They took Ron Mesa's idea around architecture. It was right around the early 80s when computers were first starting to come into schools. I don't know if any of you remember the old Apple, clunkers, and these people in Massachusetts who were technology geeks and neuropsychologists, an interesting combination, started to say there's something here we can harness. There is something about this technology that can change the trajectory of how students with disabilities can be involved and have access to the curriculum. And they have been, really, since the early 80s, working on this construct of universal design, and it keeps getting supported by increasingly more and deeper brain research. So the neuroscience part of this, because we have fMRIs and all of that stuff, we are able, not we, but there are people who are able to say, if we take this side of the room and we hook you all up and we show you that picture, we would have 16, 18 different brain profiles about whose brain is clicking on what, which neurons. So what they have found is variability and difference in how we think and how we learn is actually the norm. And even students who have similar characteristics that we say, oh, well, they're all LD, or they're all African American, or they're all short. The difference in those categories are still incredibly diverse, and that the rule of thumb is variability, not similarity, across age, culture, intellect, school success, race, ethnicity, language. It's just been teased out over and over and over again. So variability is the rule, not the exception. And UDL has this concept of systematic learner variability, and I love that term, systematic and variability. What they're saying is the kids are different. The systematic part is they're all different, but next year the group of different kids who come in are going to be the same kind of different as the kids who came in last year and the ones who will come in next year. So when we are surprised each year that our kids have such poor vocabulary, what that says more is our memory of what it felt like when the glass group came in September, we just forgot about that because you remember them in June after you got to know those kids. And the kids coming back in September, new kids in your room, they are as diverse and all over the map as your kids were the year before. We can count on that. That's the systematic part. Learner variability is predictable. And that's the beauty of universal design, is saying variability is the rule. But once we know it's always going to be this big, always plan for this big. You will know every year you're going to have some kids whose language development is really underdeveloped. It may be because they're ELL, it may be because they come from poverty and have no language, minimal language at home. It could be because they have a language disorder, and I could keep listing it. But the fact is, you're going to have kids where recognition of language is going to be a potential barrier to learning. You're gonna have some kids who have ants in their pants and they can't sit. And you can count on their younger brothers coming into your class next year. You're always gonna have kids who don't seem to want to do traditional learning activities. So that's the predictable part of variability. All right? So, how this has all been organized is through this UDL framework that basically says there are a gazillion brain networks, but UDL sort of clusters 3 brain networks. All right? Recognition, perception, and making sense of what you see, being able to receive and analyze information. It's the what of learning. Strategic, being able to plan and execute actions. That's the how of learning. And the last, the affective network. How do we evaluate and set priorities, decide what we are going to pay attention to and not pay attention to, goal setting, that kind of stuff. And that's the why of learning, and that's the affective network. All right? So you see, it follows very along with Vygotsky's work. I mean, and it's all, I mean, here is this guy a decade, almost a century ago, who nailed it, based on observation of learners. And now we actually have the brain research that supports all of that. And that's the basis of universal design, okay? So what we're going to talk about, let me just look. I'm having the hardest time. What time is our first break? 11:30, great, okay. So, great. So we've got our 3 parts of the brain here. So recognition, that's the whole back part of our brain. Strategic, our whole front part, frontal lobe, and our affective, which is actually inner, it's inside. This would be like a sliced cross section of the brain, where this is the front, this is the back. Okay, so everybody, okay, let me ask you this. Did people print out handouts? Okay, do people have this handout? Okay, this was, okay. So those of you who don't have it, I think I'll be able to keep you moving along, but this is a 1-page, what's called the Universal Design Guideline, Principles and Guidelines, okay? And what I want to do is I'm going to toggle back and forth between a couple of things, because this 1-page sheet sort of has a lot of information if you spend a lot of time, but you need to understand how it connects to the brain stuff. Okay, so you're going to see 3 columns here. Multiple means of representation, and this whole column here is connected to the concept of the recognition network. In other words, when information is presented in multiple ways, we increase the number of users who actually can recognize that information, perceive it, and make meaning of it. This blue central column, multiple means of action and expression, is all going to be related to our strategic network, being able to plan and execute what we want to do. And this last column, multiple means of engagement, are principles and guidelines specific to what we know about our affective network. All right? So, we're going to go now to the first column here on the left, which is multiple means of representation. That's connected to this part of the brain. And think about it, this is the back part. Okay, so here are my eyes. This is the back part of my brain here. This is the part of the brain that interprets and identifies and interprets patterns of sensory information from the environment. So in order for my recognition network to be activated, there has to be some stimulus, okay? And the recognition network is recognizing and making meaning of that stimulus, all right? And we know there are 3 sort of central components to that recognition network, and each of those, and I'll tell you what they are, connect to one of these areas, okay? So when you look at this column, it's saying we need to provide multiple means of representation for kids because in this part of the brain, first kids have to perceive, literally, sensorily perceive. In other, you've got to be able to see it, you've got to be able to hear it. So this part of the brain is where we're always thinking about, we have to provide options for perception. So in other words, if I have a kid who is a low vision kid, I am going to always be looking at font size. I'm going to be looking at the physical material and how it's designed. Can the kid actually see it? Okay, so the perceptual stuff can be very, very concrete. If I've got a kid who's deaf in one ear, I need to make sure there are alternatives for getting auditory information, whether it's as simple as seating the kid in a particular place, amplifying the room, whatever, okay? So this part of the brain is where information is sensorily perceived. And if we have a kid where this part of the brain is not their strong suit, UDL is saying, okay, this is part of recognition or presentation. Think strategically about who in your class needs options for perception. Once we perceive information, we actually then have to make meaning of it. So if I see a word on the blackboard, this part of my brain is what's allowing me to say, oh, that's a C. C makes a k sound. C is the first letter in my name, okay? So once I see it and perceive it, I've got to actually know what it actually means. So it's the recognition of letters, language, math expressions, symbols, all right? And this part of the network, the guidelines, okay, I've got my big principle. My first guideline is options for perception. My second guideline is options for language, mathematical expressions, and symbols. So this is where, when we have kids who've got syntax issues, vocabulary, there's some background knowledge piece here, right? This last part is, okay, I see it, I recognize it, here is, and now, what does it mean? It's the comprehension. So a lot of kids can see words, they can read the word, but what's happening? They don't understand the meaning of the word or what to do with that. So we provide options for comprehension. All right, so here's what I want to do. I'm going to flip over to a link, because I want to show you two things. One is, I went to udlcenter.org. It's all in your PowerPoint, okay? And I say, I want to go to the guidelines, okay? And I click on the guidelines. And it takes me to the guidelines. And then I say, here's a crunched version of my headings, representation, okay? So there's two things. Any of you who printed out the handouts, you have in the packet behind this was the first page, you have the printed out version of what I'm going to show you. Okay, so this is the text of all of the principles, guidelines, and the exemplars they give you. All right? Now, for someone like myself, here's an example of how preferences alter what part of my brain is working. I prefer hard copies of things. I'd prefer to have this document, highlight it, put my sticky notes on it, make my notes on it. Many of you see this as just obsolete, and you will work off of this website. So that's an example, multiple means of presentation. I'm going to show you a digital way to access this information, and I've given you a print way. Okay, so I'm going to click on, and I'm going to go to language expression. This is the second principle here. And it says, okay, learners vary in their facility with different forms of representation, both linguistic and non-linguistic. Vocabulary that may sharpen and clarify concepts for one learner may be opaque and foreign to another. Why is that? Because your brains are like this, all right? And then it goes on to, provide a very succinct, but like right there, what does it mean, okay? And then it says, but we can break this down to 5 different areas. Clarify vocabulary and symbols, clarify syntax and structure, support decoding, promote understanding across languages, illustrate through multiple media. And what I can do then is I can click on what they call a checkpoint. So I'm going to click on supports decoding, and then it says, the ability to fluently decode words, numbers, or symbols that have been presented in an encoded format, visual symbols for text, haptic symbols for braille, blah, 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 takes practice for any learner, but some learners will reach automaticity more quickly than others. Learners need consistent and meaningful exposure, blah, 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 blah. And then I can say, it says, and here are examples of 5 different ways I can provide multiple pathways. If I have kids, if the unit or the lesson I'm working on really requires kids to recognize symbols, I can have speech to text available. I can use automatic voicing with digital mathematical notations. I can use digital text with accompanying human voice. I can allow for flexibility and easy access to multiple representations, offer clarification of notations through key terms, blah, 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 blah. And then it says, but tell me more. And I click on View Examples. And then what I go to is a page that just, and this scrolls down for maybe 20, 30 items. Basically, they're saying, and here are tools you can bring into your classroom that if you don't already have text-to-speech, here are 5 different products that you might be able to look at, and they're free. Okay? So we need to, obviously we want to do digital text and all kinds of things in a systematic way within our system, but as teachers you need tools in your toolbox right now. And what this website does, so just as an example, and I know it's really small, but let's just say the top one, ClickSpeak. ClickSpeak is a text-to-speech function designed for sighted users who want to hear text read aloud. It's compatible with Windows and Mac. It's for all age groups. It can be used for all content. It's free, and it requires an internet connection. Voki, also a speech generator. All ages, all contact, free internet connection. And you can just scroll down. So for every one of those checkpoints, you can just drill down. And if you don't want to go through all of that, just read this. Okay, so this handout starts on page 14. 1 through 13 is just all the background information I gave you. Okay, so I just printed out. This is where all of the principles, 3 big principles, multiple means of representation, multiple means of expression, multiple means of engagement. And then under each principle, There are 3 guidelines, and then under each guideline, there's 2, 3, 4, 5 checkpoints, and you can just keep drilling down. So this alone could expand people's toolkit literally overnight. You know, I mean, there would be tools from this you could consider actually accessing next week for your kids if you had the time to just sit down, think it through, okay? So this opens up all of the technology pieces. UDL embraces the idea of technology. I mean, basically, UDL says, duh, why would you not? We truly, it's like, you know, in the movies, we have the technology. Why are we not getting it, the right technology, into the right kids' hands? Because we have some kids who, with technology in their hands, the impact of their disability, the adverse effect of their disability would plummet. Certainly not all kids. We know we've got some kids with just profound needs. But we've got lots of kids, if we're truly talking about access, not looking seriously at technology use. And again, I'm not talking about all the shiny new things and the bells and the whistles. That's just the strategic use. So many of these tools are just ubiquitous now, you know. But here's the nice thing, is we know there have been educators doing universal design for learning before universal design for learning was invented, and before there was any technology. And those were just master teachers who intuitively knew that their learners were variable and one size didn't fit all. So I don't want people to be discouraged if you don't have access to a lot of technology. There are low-tech versions of all of this, and we know good teachers have been doing those things for eons. So, but I do think we can't overlook this. Okay, so does this make sense how this relates now? Okay, so I'm going to go through a couple of more of the networks before. I want to go through the 2 networks, and then when we come back after lunch, we're going to start looking at UDL tools, planning tools around lesson design, those kinds of things. Okay? Does that sound all right? Whether it does or not, that's what I'm doing. Okay? But I just thought I would ask. Okay, so let me get back to where we were. And, okay, so we just did this, and now we're on to strategic. This is my favorite part because I think frontal lobes are just fascinating. Okay, so this is the frontal lobe. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. That, you know, when we talk about kids' executive skills, you know, it's that whole part of our brain. And the strategic network gets at, I'm right under something here, gets at the what does it take to plan and execute actions in, you know, on the environment. So a lot of people think about this as the assessment component, but it's really how do kids demonstrate what they know and are able to do. And anytime we ask a kid a question, anytime we ask a kid to do a learning task, the strategic one, they have to recognize what it is you're asking them. That's recognition. But then when they begin to execute that plan, this is their strategic network. And you can see how these networks do not operate separately or sequentially. It's like going on. But I mean, the fact is that we can actually isolate the different parts of the brain now. So here's what we know. Clicker, where's my clicker? Here we go. We know that, again, for the strategic network, we have 3 different components. This top part, and it's really not right at the edge, but it's right in there. This is what is the motor part. In other words, if you're asking me to do a task, I actually have to have the capacity to do that. So let's say you're asking me to write, I need to have the ability to hold a writing implement and write, okay? So that's the physical part. So we have to have options for that because we have to vary methods for response and navigation. We know some kids will type. We know some kids will use a pointer. We know some kids will need an eye gaze to communicate on a screen. That's what we're talking about here. There has to be, some kids just physically do not have the capacity to do the physical action. So we need multiple ways to get over that hump. Then we need to, if you have the ability to do it, you then have to actually be skillful at it. That's skill and fluency. You need to have ways to express and communicate. Multiple media for communication, multiple tools for construction and composition, fluencies with graduated levels of support. And then that's this part. And then the last is what we typically think of as executive skill, and that's the frontal lobe, and that's planning and executing. So in other words, you ask me to write a paragraph about the science lesson we just did, and this last part is me being able to then say, okay, write a paragraph. I need to get my pencil. I need to find my journal book, open it up. I need to know how to position it on my desk. I need to know that I always have to put my name in the right-hand corner. I've got to plan all of that stuff. And executive skills are so much more than just planning. I mean, it's very, very complex. We're talking about planning, prioritizing, how to figure out which, how to break things down and figure out what's the first thing to do. I mean, executive skills are just huge. And I would venture to say, for a good number of our kids with disabilities, hello, it's sort of like walking into a middle school, and again, it's, I'm always fascinated when I go to middle school. Who teaches middle school here? Have you seen a frontal lobe lately in your buildings? I mean, none of them have them, right? I mean, like Swiss cheese, because they're developing their frontal lobes all through school. This is one of those areas where you have to say, you have to pick an appropriate challenge, then scaffold. We don't nearly scaffold enough for kids' executive skills. For some reason, we think once they get to 5th grade, they should always remember their pencil. It's like, how's that going? I mean, these are kids who need way more scaffolding because what we know is this part of our brain is actually developing well into early adulthood. This part of our brain is developing. Some of you college kids, I can see your frontal lobes developing right as we speak. No, really, well into early 20s. That part of our brain is still developing. So if we've got a 8-year-old, who looks like he can't find his way out of a paper bag, it's because he can't. I mean, he really, some kids just don't have those connections. And that's, we sometimes, I see many teachers struggle with how to scaffold around this part of kids' life. But this is critical. Okay, so, and then I just want to do the affective piece, and then we'll start our lunch break. And this is again, keep in mind, this is a cross-section of the brain. So this is internal. This is the part, it's the why part. It's how we engage, what motivates us. It's the part that allows us to look at what's the salient information here, set goals, prioritize in terms of personal goal setting, paying attention, sustaining attention. These are all things that are connected affectively. When things are not important to us, when things don't resonate with us, our ability to lose attention and not persevere is way, way higher. So again, same kind of model here. multiple means of engagement. We've got to provide options for recruiting information. We know for a lot of kids, we've just got to get them interested. For some kids, it's about sustaining effort and persistence. And I think, you know, we're talking a lot of habits of mind kind of things here. Social, emotional, affective behavior, a lot of PBIS-y kinds of things here. And then the last, which is the ultimate one, options for self-regulation. I go into schools all the time now, and we're talking about things, and it's just a matter of minutes before somebody says, you know, our biggest issue is behavior. I know we're supposed to talk about the standards, but oh my God, you know, you should see my class, or you should, the whole school is, you know, bouncing off the walls. This stuff around self-regulated learners, I mean, is so critical. You cannot be a really effective and efficient learner when you cannot self-regulate. You know, I mean, when you cannot set goals and be able to monitor your self-regulations, being able to monitor your own behavior. So you can see how some of this is so at cross purposes, you know, when a kid can't do this, how poor affective networks, or, you know, how that trumps recognition and expression. In other words, you can plan the most beautiful lesson, but if you don't have that kid engaged, we all have seen some of our most beautiful lessons go right down the toilet for kids. Why? Because we couldn't crack this code, you know, for that kid or for that learner profile, that class profile. All right? So that's the basis of universal design, to say how we think, and when we come back we're going to then say, what's the connection to instruction? And hopefully some of this has already begun to hit you in terms of when we talk about IEPs and the kinds of goal areas we set. But when we come back from lunch, we're going to talk about the explicit connection to lesson, you know, how we analyze lessons, how we look at our learner profiles, and how we connect, where in a kid's IEP all of this information should be presented, the dots connected, and handed to a classroom teacher on a silver platter. That, to me, is what, when we talk about classroom teachers, we don't talk about you a lot, really, but when I talk to classroom teachers about universal design, oftentimes the first thing they'll say is, where do we get all this information? How am I going to know this about my learners? I think teachers know way more about their learners than they think, because you're watching them every day. So within a short period of, you may not know that on day one of school, but you guys know a lot about your kids. But what I always say is, you should be begging to have kids with IEPs in your classroom, because I'm actually giving you all that information right up front. I'm telling you where all of those networks are stronger, where they're weaker, and I'm telling you what to do about them. So that all of that exploratory stuff we have to do about getting to know learners, well-written IEPs should be telling the UDL story for every kid. Your state form may chunk it differently than response, expect, you know, but I would urge you to start thinking about how, if we started using some UDL language when we're writing our present levels of performance, when we're writing student strengths, when we're talking about how disability adversely affects a kid. Personally, when I do my IEP training now, I'm constantly using those words, because I'm hoping how we have written IEPs traditionally have not resonated particularly well with many classroom teachers. They don't find them nearly as useful as we think they are. We've got to pay attention to that. You know, these are not people who don't want to help kids. They're people who are saying, I just read a 12-page document and I still don't know what to do for the kid. So for us in special ed, we gotta do that better. And I'm hoping UDL could be that language that allows us to sort of describe all kids through similar kind of ways. Okay. Over the next hour and 15 minutes, we'll move into the more of the practical application around some of the tools associated with universal design. And again, through it all, trying to make those critical connections of what about universal design overlaps with the more traditional IEP planning process. And I would just ask people right now, before we go any further, to just think about that. How many of you are special ed teachers? All right. So if, and the rest classroom teachers? Yeah. So from your perspective, whether you're the IEP writer and special ed provider or the classroom teacher, based on what we covered this morning or before lunch, multiple means of representation, multiple means of expression, multiple means of engagement, recognition, strategic, affective. What of that resonates with what we think of as the traditional IEP? I mean, I want to see what connections you are making. So just take a minute or so to think about that. Whether you think about what section of the IEP this stuff would fall in, or what you as a classroom teacher, when you get an IEP, what would you wish somebody was telling you in it relative to the concept of universal design? So just take a second to think about that, and we'll just do a quick share out, and then we're going to get into tools. Right, so the present level of academic achievement and functional performance, clearly, if well written, would be addressing a whole potential range of all three of those networks. Because if the student's disability is affecting how they receive information or how they are able to demonstrate what they know, or any of those affective issues, that would all come up under the present level. When you think about present level as the section of the IEP that also speaks to how does the student's disability affect involvement and progress in the general ed curriculum. That, to me, is what I see as that huge intersection. It's specifically asking what I think UDL is designed to answer. For this particular kid who does have a disability, what about that disability, and what about how a one-size-fits-all classroom could potentially be on a collision course? And so in a sense, you would be communicating to the classroom teacher, not that the assumption that teachers are all providing one size fits all, but to say, I'm telling you right up front, these are the sizes that this kid needs. Right up front, I'm saying, if you predominantly communicate, deliver information verbally in your classroom, I'm telling you this kid there will be barriers. Provide the visual input. I mean, that you're specifically able to connect. What other area do you think? Because again, keep in mind, some of us, when we think about affective, it's about motivation, what kids do well. What other parts of the IEP do you think some of the UDL principles might fit in? Mm-hmm. Yep. The more targeted we are about what it is we want the child to do, the more specific we can become in saying what will truly allow the kid to do that, and how will the kid be able to truly demonstrate what he or she knows. What else?
I'm thinking like the accommodations.
The accommodations. I mean, when you think about the strategies on the UDL guidelines, many of those will translate directly to when providing oral information, provide this accommodation. When providing, when asking the kid to be able to let you know an answer to something, you might have to provide the opportunity for him to give a verbal answer as well as a written answer. So certainly the accommodation section. So we're looking at points of intersection that almost run right through the document. We talk present levels, how disability affects, goals, accommodations. And the last one that I haven't heard anybody say is, but think about it, strengths. You have some kids whose strengths may be in, they really do recognize information well. You know, they're going to fall apart on the execution piece, but their recognition networks are fine. Let's promote that. Let's identify those things that we can then leverage for all the other areas we know we're going to potentially run into, challenges with kids. So we've got those areas when the modalities kids have are either intact or actually their strength. Again, think about it. We have lots of kids where we would say their auditory comprehension is actually strong. Their reading comprehension, not so. I'm going to start my strength section with his auditory comprehension is a strength. And then I'm going to say, couple that with. So we want to identify all of these dimensions where the kid may actually fall onto, when we think about that jagged profile, not all, if most of your kids, strength, weakness, strength, weakness, strength, weakness, you're trying to capture everything from that strengths column. So don't overlook that some of your kids really have some strong processes. Here's the other piece. Some of your kids have very strong interests and preferences. And that's about which network? Affective. The affective network is about getting the hook into kids, getting their attention, sustaining their attention, getting them to be willing to persevere, sometimes in the face of challenges. So we're constantly looking for what will make this task more meaningful to this youngster. We're trying to take tasks, activities, actions that may not initially grab a kid. In other words, the kid doesn't like to write. So the fact that you're excited about this new writing assignment may not go over as well. But if I know this is a kid who really loves anything about trucks, I can strategically, at times, bring that kid's interest and preference right in front of the kid. So I want to identify those also. And many of our IEPs don't actually have a place for interests and preferences for younger kids. Does your IEP? I know under kids' transition plans, we talk about strengths, interests, and preferences. I'd like for you to consider when you're talking about kids before transition planning age, when you talk about kids' strengths, expand that. Strengths, interests, preferences. When the example I had given you before, when I was showing you the tool on the computer, Carol's preference is to have a hard copy. So, why not just put that right up front? Don't make a teacher go on a scavenger hunt for that piece of information. See, that's what I think a lot of, when we write IEPs, IEP writers know their kids forward and backwards. So you are mentally filling in the picture when you write the words, and usually the words are not nearly as descriptive about the kid as what you know. So I think that's just something we need to be thoughtful of as we're writing IEPs. We had a conversation, that many gen ed teachers say, one, give me the summary. I don't have time. But sometimes even our summaries are cryptic. We need to be very explicit. And I believe starting to use terminology like response, expression, affective, hopefully over time we'll have these worlds merging because it's really how kids' brains work. Okay, so that's just as we go through this next section, I want you to be keeping in mind what of this is translating into IEPs. All right, so where do we go from here? What I want to discuss with you now and just share with you a few of the kinds of tools that have been developed by the people who have really created universal design for learning. And I'm not sure if I mentioned this earlier, but further in your PowerPoint, I've given you a list of several links that I think have some real interesting UDL stuff. And the one at the very, very top is www.cast.org. And CAST is the Center for Applied Special Technologies. This is the group of people who created what we call Universal Design for Learning, this organization in Massachusetts. So CAST and then the UDL Center, both of these are great resources for all of it, just great resources. But CAST has a lot of the tools that I've given you in your handout, and they have many, many more. So that would be the place if you wanted to download tools and see what other tools they have for very systematic planning. That's where you would go. But let's sort of connect now UDL to access to the curriculum. UDL, or curriculum, is one of those words that sort of has a lot of different meanings to a lot of people. But in the traditional sense, when we say, what's my school district's curriculum, or this is the curriculum I'm teaching, we're talking about multiple components. Usually a curriculum is representative of goals or learning standards, learning targets, the methods with which we're going to deliver that information, the materials with which we're going to deliver it, and the range of different ways we assess what kids know and are able to do. So I'm using the term curriculum sort of as the umbrella for these four components. And each of these plays a critical component as we're thinking about, do we have a universally designed lesson here? Do I have a universally designed curriculum? Universal design, UDL would say, kids are not, the issue of disability is not the kid. Universal design would say the disability is the curriculum. When we have a one-size-fits-all curriculum, in other words, we have goals that are very narrow, we have one way to deliver things, we have one set of options available to kids to engage with materials, and we have very limited assessment tools, that's what's actually disabled, is the one-size-fits-all curriculum. The kids are just the kids. If we think about that variability, they're just the kids who walk into your room in September. They're the users. How flexible or inflexible these are speaks to who's gonna access. You know, and again, if everything's designed for the average, we know we're going to have a lot of kids who aren't going to meet it. So, goals. Let's talk briefly about goals. And goals could be synonymous with you set a learning target, you set a goal for this unit, and they're usually connected to standards of some sort. Universal design talks about we have to be very, very careful to differentiate the purpose of the standard or the goal from the means. Meaning, if the purpose of the standard is for kids to be able to describe the main idea and the details, there are a lot of ways to get kids to be able to demonstrate that. Okay? So we need to know if the goal is understand main idea and details, then how we are going to address methods, materials, and assessments is going to build in multiple ways for the kid to engage in that material and multiple ways for them to show me. As opposed to saying, this is about main ideas and details, and the only way you can actually learn about main ideas and details is to read a hard copy of a text and then write a 5-sentence paragraph. Do you see how read a text, read a hard copy of a text, and write the paragraph? There are two sets of means there. Read a text, write a paragraph. As opposed to describe main idea. I can get the main idea and details by hearing something, by watching a movie. I can describe them by writing about them, by drawing about them, by talking about them. So we always want to be very careful from the onset when we have a goal is that we don't embed the means into the purpose when in fact they weren't a part of the purpose. Now, sometimes the purpose is to read a text. But we certainly know there's value in being able to understand the main idea or details of a movie, of a play, of listening to a book on tape. So you see, one is very flexible, one's very inflexible. And we lose many of our kids around the access issue when we say, if you can't read the text, that just precludes you engaging with the concept of main idea and detail. And who the hell are we to deny a kid? What's the important part of that standard? The important part of that standard is main idea and details. Of course we want kids to read. We have some standards that are strictly about reading, but we get overly prescriptive that the only way you can learn stuff is by reading, which means kids begin to have that knowledge gap because if they can't read, they stop learning about main idea and details because they can't, there's nothing for them to latch on to. Does that make sense? This, I think, is so at the core of so many challenges that we are facing, is that many teachers feel, many teachers and schools and departments put in means that weren't there to begin with, and then want to argue that they need to stay there. You know, when I say, I think there really are many ways the kid can, oh no, it has to be this. Well, where does it say it has to be that? Show me the standard. So I understand I'm oversimplifying a very complex issue here, because we know we do have many standards that are very challenging and many standards that really do focus on certain means. We do want kids to read, but there's lots of ways to get kids to read. I can give them a book on tape, I can give them digital text, you know, and for some kids who will never be readers, I am saying you can listen and learn the critical parts of ELA. So that's the very first thing, is how good are we, how attuned are we to be able to say, what's the standard, what's the goal? And I'm not saying alter the goal. If it is truly a means is embedded, we have to get very creative. But let's not throw more obstacles in front of ourselves as educators, and most importantly, in front of kids. So, I want to, before we go any further, I just want to I'll come back to the other ones, but I want to show you a handout. So the goal represents the true purpose. Don't confuse the means with the ends. And goals enable us to determine alternative pathways and scaffolds that can be used to meet diverse learning needs. So in your tools packet, I just want to share this template with you. Oh, this is always the part that's frustrating or challenging when people don't have things printed out. So I just want to make sure to reference to you, a big version of this, full-size version of this, is in the tools packet, as are all of the other tools. Now, I do a lot of training around writing IEPs aligned to Common Core or aligned to standards. And this is sort of my template that I use to help people. And I'm bringing it in now because the very first thing you do, think about this sheet as having sort of two components. The top part is generic. Generic in the sense of it's about a particular standard. We always start off with what's the purpose of the standard? And you have to sort of unpack the standard before we really know that. And you know, like there would be a standard, we'd break down what knowledge would we be wanting the kid to learn. So a lot of this is going to be, what knowledge? We're talking a lot of this is recognition network. The verbs, what will the kid have to do to demonstrate this? A lot of that's strategic. And then I actually talk about, tell me everything that's going to get in the way of the kid. Not get in the way of the kid. Tell me every process that you need to sort of kick into gear to do this standard. And then restate it simply. You know, boil it down to what's the true purpose of this standard. All right? So I'm going to show you here. I took, now this is Common Core. I understand you may not be doing Common Core, but you just get the gist here. This is a 6th grade standard on reading for informational text. Here's the standard. Determine a central idea of a text and how it's conveyed through particular details. Provide a summary of the text distinct from personal opinion or judgment. So I go, okay, well, to do this, what does a kid need to do? They need to know what a central idea is. They need to know what a detail is. See, I can't teach stuff if the kid doesn't recognize it, okay? So I know part of the knowledge of this is not read. The knowledge here is understand what a central idea is. See, it's beginning to put shape to what's the real purpose of this standard. What does the kid have to do? The kid's going to need to be able to distinguish, choose things. They're going to have to be able to summarize. These are things I may have kids who can't make these kinds of actions. And then I talk here about, well, you would have to be able to recognize words. You'd have to recognize vocabulary. That's a recognition issue. You'd have to be able to plan multi-step processes. That's an executive skill. You have to have a certain interest level to persevere in this activity. So I'm pulling apart the standard and then basically saying, here's what the standard is, in my mind. And I would actually, the newer version of this states it a little different. The newer version says, based on evidence, provide summary of main ideas and details. That's what that standard is about. Based on evidence, provide the summary of details. Okay. Now, because it's a reading for informational text, it's implied that the kid is reading something to get that information. It's implied that the kid will write a summary. And all I'm saying is you have to actually look at the standard. The word read and write is not there. See where I'm going with this? That sure, if the kid could read a textbook and tell me that, terrific. But I am not going to deny this kid learning this standard because he can't read a traditional textbook. And I'm not going to deny this kid being able to show that this kid truly understands, can create a summary of the main ideas and details because he can't write a paragraph. So that, to me, goes back to the whole goal part here of that's a point of huge discussion between gen ed and special ed? See, because special ed can't know all of this. You know, you're not standards experts. This is what we're looking for, the gen ed partner to be able to look at this, and yet sometimes we have to challenge each other's thinking about that. Because there's something about, I don't know what it is, but sometimes we just put things in the standards, and then we begin to believe that they're actually there, and we don't have the flexibility. There will be many things you will not have flexibility on. Don't put more into that bucket. We're looking to have more flexibility, not less. Does that make sense? Okay, and I apologize that I actually have the wrong standard here, the wrong form, because what I have is this top. See, once I do this, any kid I'm working with central idea and details on, this is already done. Now, I'm getting ready to write Billy's IEP, and the bottom part now is much more detailed, you know, but the bottom part is, what are the potential barriers for Billy? What's the impact of Billy's disability? He's got poor working memory, poor reading comprehension, and poor organizational skills in writing. And when we're talking about an IEP, and I believe we're actually having the same conversation when we're trying to figure out who's my class profile and what do I need to create multiple pathways, you're looking at, this is the gap analysis. If this is what's required, and this is what the kids' strengths and areas of needs are, what pathways do I need to create to minimize that gap? So that's why it's critical that we know the goal and we don't create obstacles in the goal itself, because we know kids will have many, many other barriers. When this kid doesn't have a good working memory system, it might be hard to read something and be able to remember long enough to get it onto a graphic organizer. If this kid can't decode effectively, decoding 6th grade material may be a problem. Well, I don't want to put him in a 2nd grade reader. I want him to understand the main idea and detail of 6th grade material, because why? He's a 6th grader. So I can say, poor reading comprehension needs to be able to recognize letters and words. What's the mismatch here? Maybe if this kid had digital text, anytime he's reading new information, that digital text would bridge the gap that he doesn't have the 6th grade vocabulary yet, but if he touches the word, it gives it to him. All right? So in my mind, this is like 6 of one, half dozen of the other. How do you write IEP goals to align to standards? But it's the same metacognitive process for figuring out, for any kid, what's their strength, what of their recognition networks, expressive, or what of their networks work well, are not as strong, what's required of the task, and where are we matching and where are we mismatching? And when we have those mismatches, that's when we know I've got to provide more options. I've got to provide another option. If this kid has a poor working memory, if I have 5 kids in my class who have a poor working memory, well then I need to know everybody is going to have a certain tool, you know, a graphic organizer. I'm going to teach them how to read with a pencil. You know, I'm going to teach every kid, how are you going to read with a pencil so that when you are reading this and you think you've gotten to a main idea, you underline it. So you can come back when you're ready to summarize and go back to all the underlined pieces. So, you know, I mean, there could be a zillion different strategies, but I've got to recognize that, and in an IEP, That's the accommodation I would be listing. How does disability affect? I'd be describing that. Here's how it affects. If this, do that. For kids who are not on IEPs, I think we still are fundamentally still needing to do the same process. And what UDL says is, get your class profile. Look at, who do I have here? What are their strengths? I know no matter what I do, I have 2 kids, 4 kids, 12 kids, where recognizing vocabulary is going to be a challenge. So I know no matter what I do, I always have to have an option when it comes to recognizing vocabulary that's going to work for those kids. You begin to just from the design up say, these are my users. And if I need 4 options because of this profile, every time I do this, I have 4 options. I don't have an option and then retrofit 3 more. I bring 4 options to the table. So that's the goal part of this. And in my mind, and I'm sorry I don't have the right form up here, but anyone who emails me, I've just refined this a little bit more. But this, I think, gets to the goal issue. We need to know, what are we trying to do? Because what we've done for a lot of kids with disabilities, and my next workshop is on accommodations, and I think this is that slippery slope. UDL is trying to get us to see we can probably get way more kids to meet standards if we thought about multiple pathways. Oftentimes what we think of is first is let's lower the standard because then the kid can get there. And that's the bane of existence for kids with disabilities, is we go to the lowest common denominator. Oh, well, we can get him to read this if we give the 6th grade or 2nd grade text. Well, at some point that 6th grader is not being exposed to ideas, concepts, and words that 6th graders need to know about because they're 6th graders. Will we have some kids who are going to read on the 2nd grade level? Of course. We have some kids who have massive, coexisting disabilities. And if we can get them to read on a 6th grade level, that's great. But we have lots of kids with disabilities. They can hear just fine on a 6th grade level. And if the issue is about an idea or content, we've got to get them there. So everyone get this? All right, so now I just want to go back to methods and materials. Again, we either have one way, we're going to do a lecture, or we're going to do a lecture and we're going to also have some multimedia, and a kid's going to have a tablet in front of them. We're just talking about multiple ways around these things. Methods, how we're going to teach, the materials, the tools we use for the teaching. So what I want to show you is again, here's the problem is you won't all be able to do this activity, but that's what we're going to do now, is CAST has what they call Finding UDL Solutions. And they say, well, look at traditional methods and materials. All right, printed materials, lecture and chalkboard or whiteboard, internet research, chapter tests, written reports, oral reports, fixed project requirements. You must do a diorama that has these components and that's it. Okay. Does anybody have this handout? Okay. What I want you to do, and see if maybe you can just take 1 or 2 of these and then just on your own paper, I'd like you to think about, pick any one of these sort of traditional methods or materials, then talk about what are the potential barriers. When you think about your class, your kids, or any group of kids, what are the potential problems, the barriers that are going to be there? And think about that in terms of the 3 networks. In some cases, some of these affect only one of the networks. In some cases, they affect all 3 of the networks. All right? And then to be able to say, what would an alternative be? I mean, this is the very beginning of thinking about lesson planning, is understanding there are certain barriers that have affect certain networks. We need to be thinking about connecting this to the networks and then looking at what are the options within each of those networks. So here's what I would like. Normally I have everybody working in groups, but I don't know if people have groups. So I'd like everybody to pick one thing. And let's go around the room because you can't all pick the same thing. Okay? So printed materials, could you guys do lecture and chalkboard, internet research, chapter test, and then next table written report, back there oral report. You, yep. Or you can join somebody, that's fine. But do you, if, you know, I don't want everybody doing written material. I want people to think about different ideas. And the same thing with you, okay? Written materials. Maybe you guys can do written materials together. You do. Okay? Lecture and chalkboard, internet, chapter test. So could everybody just complete their line? Do you see it's, what are your missed opportunities or barriers? You think you can have a kid in mind. You can have your class in mind, okay? But it's really thinking about which of the networks, everybody remember, recognition, strategic, affective, are the barriers connected to one or more of those, and what would you do differently? Make sense? So let's do a quick debrief. Who would like, now some of you have pulled up your tools. You're looking at your guidelines, but let's just see. I have a sheet. Let me pull it up, and let's just go through, and we'll compare what you have with how, and I don't know if you can see this is glasses. I'll make this a little larger if I can. Now this is right off of the this UDL Finder solution. This is part of the CAST website, and here's their version of this. So who had printed materials? What did you guys have? So difficult seeing small text. You know, again, if we have printed material, whatever it's printed as is what it is. The font is the font, the size is the size, the contrast is the contrast, you know, the number, how wide the margins are, how much white space to print is all fixed. And for some people who have perceptual issues, low vision, those kinds of things, that can be a deal breaker. But also for people like me, who are getting older, it's not a disability for me. I'm just 62 and I can, you know, see for squat. And then for other people, you know, there are people who buy large print books not because they can't see, but because they prefer large print. So, but what is this? This is all about our recognition network. It's about seeing. Both of yours were actually recognition network. And what would you have as your solutions? The difficulty comprehending and decoding is not just the recognition, it's also the strategic, because the strategic would be, you know, things like the concept map of a kid is reading the material but is having difficulty making those connections. We have other, you know, concept maps, hyperlinks, all kinds of things. So, you know, and you added more. I mean, you talked about the auditory, read aloud. It could be a book on tape. You know, I mean, CAST is very big on digital text, so you're going to constantly see digital text here. But there are low-tech versions of the same thing. You know, the book on tape is the 1990s version of digital text. And given your school, your resources, we take what we have and we move forward. So, you know, the read aloud is the low tech, the lowest of low tech. You know, a kid doesn't have a book on tape, but he's got a reading buddy. So somebody is always providing that auditory stimulus. Good. Okay, lecture and chalkboard. Who had that? What did you guys come up with? So again, difficulty with extracting key points, note-taking, and both of those are strategic. This is strategic and recognition, and you're right, the whole affective piece. And your point earlier, they didn't have the affective listed for the book, but I would say the same exact thing. You know, kids have to have an interest in it, or they have to have the skill of persistence, goal setting and persistence, because we know there's a lot of things in school that kids sort of have to do, and that we get them to comply, one, because some kids are just incredibly compliant, we can get them to do anything, or we hope that kids are developing those affective skills that allow them to say, not everything is going to be my preference, but I can still persevere, set this as a goal and persevere. So all of the recent research, or the growing research, it's not recent, I mean, it just continues to escalate, is the affective network trumps everything. You know, they're all critical, but if we can't get that kid at the affective network level engaged, you can have created the best lesson, the best of anything. That affective piece is unbelievably powerful, and all the more recent research that comes out just keeps saying it's all critical, but do not underestimate the power of engaging that kid and dealing with those skills, and particularly the self-regulatory skills. Great. Okay, so internet research. Who did that? When we get on internet, kids can find all kinds of information. It's what's relevant and how do you sort through that. And we have a lot of kids who just would find that terrifically difficult, and then keeping track of the information. Good, very good ideas. All right, so what did we have next? Chapter test. Yeah, and you know, just text, forget about ELL, just kids who have test anxiety. You know, we have a lot of kids on a chapter test. The format is what stumps them. For ELL kids, it may be format as well as all of the language stuff you've talked about. But if Jen just recognizes, if the point is to really know, does the kid know something? And that paper and pencil test is not going to be the true showing. So great, good ideas, very good. Okay, written report. Good. And again, guys, think about those checkpoints going right to your chart or that handout. It's great information. Good. Okay, last, fixed projects. Yeah, and so strategic is the, where do I start? Right, you know, you have some kids who just cannot get out of the gate. They just don't, truly, their frontal lobes are just, they're not where they need to be. And you know, a lot of kids, task initiation is part of that executive network that they can't do. Sometimes kids can start the task, but they don't know what to do afterwards. So it's multidimensional. And then certainly the affective part. You know, the kids who have anxiety about task completion, I mean, there's all kinds of elements. So I'm going to move on, and I want to show you the class profile and a couple of other tools, but I just wanted to these are the tried and true traditional methods and materials that are used in classrooms. I would hope more and more classrooms are expanding, but I can't tell you how many high school classes I walk into for a 90-minute block. That is 90 minutes of lecture chalkboard. I guarantee you there are a lot of kids who are walking out of that class not getting what they need from that. Excuse me. So this is about saying, start with what we know how to do. We don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's not saying don't ever lecture. It's saying you've got to have the multiple pathways. So anyway, I just thought this is a way to begin your thinking about that. Let me show you, and then I want to get to the class profile piece. Whoops. Again, in your packet, which hopefully you will download, but we're not going to spend time on this, but this is about analyzing the lesson. And there's one for analyzing the lesson for recognition networks, and then for strategic and for affective. But it says, okay, if I'm going to use multiple ways to present the information, it helps to start chunking that. It's just another template. Provide multiple examples. One way we focus on kids' recognition is through the use of examples and non-examples. Highlighting critical features, presenting information in multimedia, providing supports for limited background. So again, it's another way to sort of sit down once you're saying, okay, I'm ready to start planning a lesson. I know what my goal of the lesson is. What current methods am I using? And if I want to expand the use of examples and non-examples, how might I do that? So again, it's just a planning template with a lot of good prompts about, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? Now, the thing to keep in mind when you're doing universal design is nobody does all of these things simultaneously. So I don't want people to get overwhelmed and sort of like, oh my God, it already takes me an hour to plan something. This will take me 7 days to do it. Pick, it's sort of how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Pick one thing that you say, on this lesson, how could I really think more strategically about background information? The part of the recognition network that is so vital to this particular learning activity is so critical about background knowledge. Pick that one thing, and then once you start thinking that way, well, then you have that done for next year when you're doing that lesson. and then you start moving into more strategic ways. So don't get overwhelmed. Because nobody does all of this simultaneously. Last thing I want to say about assessment, and then I'm going to show you the profile piece. The last piece, we've got goals, methods, materials. So the last few examples were about planning methods and materials. The last is assessment. And this is vital to really all three of the networks. You've got to be able to recognize whatever the format of the test is in. But truly, the assessment stage very often is focused on the strategic network. The kid has to be able to put together the answer, plan it, demonstrate what they know. And we've already talked about, just in the last few examples, of how the affective network kicks in here, because we have kids who have test anxiety, they're embarrassed to stand up in front of the class because they don't speak English well, whatever that is. So again, all of the networks are constantly moving. Our job is to figure out, where does a particular kid need the most scaffolding? And I just wanted to throw up one example, which will be very difficult to see, but are people familiar with the idea of tic-tac-toe assessments? I mean, to me, this is just, the quintessential kind of universal design for learning assessment. And I apologize, it's so small. This particular, there's a colleague of mine back in New Hampshire. She developed this. Oh my God, I've had this slide for like 10 years. She was both a special ed and an English language arts teacher. So she teaches poetry. And the tic-tac-toe here is you must make at least one tic-tac-toe across vertical and work to get 100 points. And then each activity, this is writing poetry. And then there's multiple ways. If you wanted to write poems, some poem, if you did, you'll get 5 points, some you're going to get 24. And then the kids are planning, and this will be, there won't be a poetry test. By the time kids do this, she has all the information she needs to know on whether the kids got the gist of what they needed to learn in the poetry unit. So here's an example of, this is all a series of performance tasks, no paper and pencil test. And she has designed it in such a way where, one, affective, kids have choices. Kids can pick their own preference. We know kids affectively, some kids can write, some kids can sing, some kids can, do tactile things. They have the ability to demonstrate this in multiple ways, as well as clearly the recognition networks are all completely different here. So this is the kind of thing. Now, this is a very complex one, because she's using it for the entire poetry. This is the portfolio that's creating for kids. But you can do a much simpler version for this for almost every task. So that's the idea of being able to get away from the one-size-fits-all assessment by a tool such as this. Okay, so here's the learning profile one. It's really quite simple, and you can do this at 2 levels. And if you go to CAST, you can log on to, and you just log on, you register, you'll have access to all of their electronic tools. But you can literally enter your class. They give you an electrified, grid, and you can say, this is for Sally Smith, and then you hit tab, and it'll say, what are Sally's strengths? What are Sally's weaknesses? Think about Sally's, affective issues. And you can put in your entire class and create a class profile electronically through this profile builder. So the CAST website, all of these tools that I'm showing you, you can create them right on their website, enter your kids' data, and then just save it and print it out. So you don't have to create these templates. They exist already. So I've just pulled up one where this is the whole class profile. Rather than looking at kid by kid by kid, this is already I'm now making some generalizations. Okay? In my class, for this standard or this activity, the what of learning, as a general statement about my class, what are my kids' strengths? So you could do this kid by kid, or just at this point say, I know 50% of this class, these kids have vocabularies that are 2 grade levels higher. Okay? So why do I need to know that? Think about UDL. Why do I want to put down that I have kids who have vocabularies 2 grade levels above? That's right. Universal design is not about kids with disabilities. Universal design is about all kids. So when we're looking at that variability, we are saying the kids here need to have their networks addressed as well as the kids here and everybody in between. So I'm looking at strengths and I'm saying, well, I have some kids who need an extension activity. So when I'm preparing this lesson now, I am definitely having a pathway that would fall into an extension activity. And I mean, we're talking good differentiated instruction here. This is allowing you to get very, very strategic. So I'd look at my strengths for each of the networks, I'd look at my weaknesses for each of the networks, and I'd look at clear-cut preferences and interests. And when you start doing this, this stuff starts jumping off the page at you. What you typically find is if I have 20 kids, you don't have 20 different needs. If I have 20 kids, I've got 8 kids who have vocabulary issues. I've got 7 kids where focus is killing them. I've got 10 kids who are just disengaged. So you begin to see patterns here, because the idea of universal design is not that if you have 20 kids, you're going to have 20 pathways, but you have 20 kids, and on recognition activities, you're going to have 3 or 4 go-to pathways. And anything that requires recognition, you're going to use those similar pathways. Obviously, the topic changes, but the pathway becomes part of the design. So if you go on to CAST, they have a whole set of tools around this. The other nice thing with CAST is they have online modules. They have 2 modules that you just walk through, and they instruct you on every one of these tools. And you can just log on, log off. They're right on the CAST website. So they're really excellent tools. So I want to let's go back to the connections about IEPs. Everything about the 3 networks: recognition, strategic, affective. We're talking about in IEPs, what can kids do? What are their areas of strengths, areas of need, how their disability affects? And it just seems to me that gap analysis is identical to what's going on in universal design. What's expected, and then who's the learner? And how we get the kids to what's expected is through those multiple pathways. And the advantage of the IEP, when we do it well, is we've teased all of that out for the classroom teacher. And that's, for those of you who are engaged in IEP writing, that's the sort of the vision I'd like for you to start thinking about is, from a UDL perspective, would your IEP pass the stranger test? If I was a classroom teacher and I got this IEP from you and I had no opportunity to do the consultation piece, which is really the rich part, those conversations, which is where we get our best information. But if I didn't have that opportunity, and this document has to tell the right story about the kid, would this teacher have an understanding of how this kid's response, strategic, and effective brain networks were serving that kid? Strengths, needs, and what's the go-to pathways for those kids? So these are the 2 websites I've been referring to throughout. This is, sort of the mother of UDL. The UDL Center is actually a project of CAST. It was federally funded and has some additional components. All of the tools, the profile builder, the solution finder, and on CAST, they have book builders. You can take a passage, you can take a book, you can put it into a program they have, you can create your own digital text for kids. The technology tools you have access to just by registering on CAST alone. you can go from this to that literally overnight. So I encourage you to explore these. Here are a couple of other things that I have found that I think just are different people in the fields. Like this British Columbia, the whole province has gone to UDL. So this is, I think, the Vancouver School District. It's their website they set up. Power Up What Works. This is a new, the old What Works in curriculum. This is all about technology-related tools. And then the UDL Toolkit. It's a wiki space. This is actually a few years old, so it's almost now starting to be missing some critical pieces. But it's just in one place. Let me just click on it very quickly. Some very, they're just go-to tools. There are just a world of materials out there. So with that, it's 2 o'clock. I know people have to scoot to get to their next session. If you haven't already done your eval sheet, the yellow sheet, please fill it out, and you can just leave it on the way out. Thank you. Oh, the other thing, here are my cards. If you have any questions, follow-up things that you want to ask about, follow-up training, or just things we've talked about today that you want to explore different ideas, I would be happy to respond to any email inquiries. Email's easier for me than phone, but please feel free. Any way that I can assist you in your work, I would be happy to. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.